So a few weeks ago, maybe a month ago, something like that, they had some Rice Krispie treats out in the cafe. And that's a big deal. I mean, Rice Krispie treats. Who doesn't like a Rice Krispie treat? And so I was talking to these three little dudes, and we were talking about Rice Krispie treats, and well, we became fast friends. In fact, they're in here at the 9 o'clock service almost every week. Hey guys, y'all turn around and look back there. See them? Hey everybody. And so now, not every single Sunday, but periodically, they give me big hugs in the lobby and I get a Rice Krispie treat, a package of Rice Krispie treats. Y'all are the absolute best. You're also pretty cute, but I'll tell you what, y'all are the best. Thanks for that. Can I be bribed? No doubt about it. My name is Bob. I'm one of the pastors here. I'm really glad you're here as we start off a brand new preaching series. So let me take you back, not to horse and buggy days, although this church can remember that, but it was the summer of 1977. And I was entering my very last semester at Duke Divinity School, working toward my degree on the way to ordination. And I received a phone call from an older pastor that I had known for quite a few years. Now, one of the reasons I had known him is because his older brother had been my pastor in Lexington for the first 17 years, or basically all through my formative years. So he called and he said, hey, Bob, you know I'm the pastor at St. Mark's Church, and I wonder if you might be willing to come and preach for us the last week of September. And he said, it's a 5-night revival. That's what he called it. I said, sure. I mean, what an honor it would be for me to do that. So later that night, I said to Susan, do you have any idea what a revival is? And she said, now, I don't really know. Well, I was 25 years old. I didn't know anything about revivals either. I looked it up in the dictionary. Now, here's what it said: restoring something lifeless. So I thought, well, that seems like a pretty big order to go. And I thought, well, maybe St. Mark's Church is lifeless or something like that. The first night of the revival was September the 25th. So I walked into the pastor's office on the other end of our facilities here, and about 30 minutes before the service, we chatted for a while, and I asked him, I said, so exactly what is a revival, at least here in this church? He said, oh, don't worry about it. These people don't know. They don't know either. He said, just preach. And then there was a pause, and he looked at me and he said, hey, look, I don't want you to be nervous or anything, but this morning at our service, I announced my retirement. And he said, but don't let that rattle you or anything. And I said, well, should I be nervous? And he said, well, this church is going to be searching for a new pastor. And I looked at him and I said, I'm 25 years old. I don't think that's going to be a problem. And he paused and he said, you just never know, do you? And no truer words were ever spoken. Later that fall, late October, I came over here for a couple of interviews with the search committee, and December 4th, 1977, the first Sunday in December, this church voted to call me to be the next pastor of SMC. The vote was 156-8. That's 95% in favor. The 8 never confessed. They might be all gone now, to heaven or someplace. So, fast forward then, 10 years later, the worship attendance here at the church had tripled. Our financial future was very strong and growing stronger. We had successfully completed and paid for a couple of building expansions. And so by almost any measurement, everything seemed to be good, and then that's when I stumbled into a couple of potholes. Quite frankly, I had 4 defining moments, back to back to back to back, and it radically changed everything in me. First, there was an old high school buddy of mine, and he moved to Burlington to take a new job, and so I called him up and I invited him to come to church, and he said, come on, Dish, man, I hadn't been to church since we were kids. And then he said, but I might surprise you one Sunday. And he did. He came once. After church, he said, he described the service. He said, it was okay. He said, your talk was all right, but he said, everything seemed to be a little dated. He said, y'all might want to consider an upgrade. And I thought, what in the world does he know about upgrading a church? So I said, well, things are working pretty well right now. And he said, hey, look, Dish, I like you, but he said, I don't think this church would work for me. Around that same time, I developed a recreational friendship over to YMCA with a guy that had never attended church ever in his entire life. And I remember telling Susan that he was so confused about spiritual matters that I said, I don't think he would like our church. I don't think he would understand it. I don't think he would get it. I just think he'd be a misfit. Right around that same time, our resident historian here at SMC, she brought me a folder that was probably that thick, and it was full of old worship bulletins that tracked back to the 40s and 50s, and she said, I just thought you might want to thumb through these sometime in your spare time because you'll know a lot of the people whose names you see in these bulletins. I did recognize quite a few of those names, but then I started noticing the order of each service on the weekends and the song selections, and I thought, oh my gosh, that looks just like our service today. And here we were 40 years later, and I thought, man, maybe we're stuck in a time warp, but I could hear my old buddy say, it feels a little obsolete. Maybe you need an upgrade. Later that week, these things just all happen pretty, God does that every now and then. So I'm on Interstate 85 and I'm headed to Duke Medical Center to see a patient from SMC. And there was a large billboard right near the exit there at Hillsborough, and it said, do you want to be authentic and relevant? And I thought, well, that's a dumb question. Who doesn't want to be relevant and authentic? What a crazy question. But I don't even know what the billboard was about. I just noticed the question, but I could not escape the question. That night, Susan's my go-to, and I said, do you think I'm relevant and authentic? And she said, why do you wonder that? And I said, never mind. But I could not get away from wondering about what could and should and would happen if we were authentic and relevant. We were only 10 years away from the 21st century. Exactly 1 year later, Susan and I were sitting in the auditorium at the Prestonwood Baptist Church in Dallas, Texas. The place probably held 4,000 people. There were 300 of us, church leaders from all around the country. And I sat and listened to about an hour and 30 minute sermon from a guy that I'd never met before, but I was absolutely compelled and motivated because he started describing the church that we read about in the book of Acts in the New Testament, in Acts chapter 2. And at a certain point, the sermon was incredible, and he said, why can't there be churches with that kind of devotion and that kind of authentic relevance in the 20th century, where lives are changing and eternal destinies are being secured? And I was kind of leaning in, and I was wondering the same thing. Why can't there be? After that message, Susan and I got in our rental car, and I said, you know what? I'm going to do that before I die. And she said, do what? And I said, I'm going to be a part of a church like that man was talking about. And she said, well, I don't think St. Mark's I don't think they're gonna go for the kind of changes that guy was talking about. And I said, I know that. But I promise you, Susan, I'm not going to the grave until I get to be a part of that kind of church at least one time in my life. That was October 1989. The next 10 years, we were on a roller coaster. We started gradually introducing this church to some unconventional and some alternative methods for doing church. It was not a new message. Are you kidding me? The message never changes. It was not even a new mission. It was certainly not a new Bible translation or anything of the kind, but it was a new vision. It was about using some new methods and strategies to see if we could reach people who had given up on church altogether, or else maybe they were just what we sometimes call casual Christians. They're just Christians in name only, but they really don't have an authentic relationship with Jesus. Well, the raucous and sometimes difficult decade of the 90s had more than our share of challenges, but the results were there was this overflowing. It was like God's favor was just overflowing around here. Our life change numbers were absolutely staggering. Lukewarm marriages were restored. Addictions were conquered. People were serving and giving, and that energy just went through the roof. Now, many of you know that I'm a student of history, especially church history. And what I've learned over the years is that every generation, certainly in the church, every generation in church history has had to face that, you're familiar with this, that tired and worn out cliche, sometimes known as the 7 last words of the church. We never did it that way before. And we started saying, we must do a new thing. I started saying to our leaders around here, I wrote this down years ago, if the gospel is to be understood, it has to be communicated in the language of those to whom it is addressed. Duh. For example, when Martin Luther, he was the 16th century German Catholic priest who he was just really disturbed inside of himself about the way the church was headed. He wanted every person, as simple as this sounds to us, he wanted every person in Germany to be able to read the Bible for themselves. So he translated the Bible from Greek and Latin into German. He wanted every citizen in the country who could read to be able to read the Bible for themselves. He came under intense criticism because it was new, it was different. We'd never done it that way before. Just a few years later, William Tyndale translated the Bible from Latin into English for the very first time. The year was 1526. He was executed in 1536 for what was considered to be treason. We've never done it that way before. Francis Asbury was one of the first bishops in the Methodist Church in America. He decided in his era, he got on a horseback and he started traveling across the state of Kentucky preaching the gospel in these outdoor places. They called them camp meetings. Instead of Christianity being somehow contained in a church building. But we've never done it like that before. And so the Methodists just revolted against Asbury, and they sort of pushed him with skepticism and opposition because they wanted to go back to their standard way of doing church in a building, in a modest church building. You know what Bishop Asbury said? I'm just fishing with a bigger net. He improvised, customized his methods and strategies. The message didn't change, same message, but there was an authenticity and a relevance to the people living in Kentucky. When this church was in its 6th year of existence, it was 1861, before the Civil War, and the leaders at St. Mark's Church decided that they were going to change the language that was used in worship from German to English. Some of those German-speaking pioneers got pretty upset because we've never done it that way before. I grew up in Sunday school back in the 50s. The flannelgraph. That was the go-to method for teaching us the Bible. That was our version of high tech. I don't think it would make the cut today, do you? In this video-driven world. Relevant and authentic, same message. So SMC was prepared to go charging into the 21st century. The year was December 1999. Everybody was talking about, are we going to survive if you think the COVID thing is a big deal, we were trying to figure out are we going to survive the millennial bug? So right here in 99, we were about to break ground on a $7.5 million expansion. You're sitting in it, part of it right now. The future seemed to be bright and bold. Our annual growth rate in those days was around 9 or 10% every single year. We held our first outdoor baptism service on August 26th, 2001. We baptized 11 people. This expansion project, where you're sitting right now, was just a big mud hole. The foundation hadn't even been completed yet. But on that August afternoon, how little did we know that in only 15 days, our country would be brought to its knees when a group of hate-filled terrorists made a mockery of our freedom on September the 11th. It was a punch in the gut. But still, we felt like that we were being prompted by the Spirit of God to push ahead and to not let 9/11 overcome us and to fearlessly walk into an unknown 21st century, to not fold up in fear. So we pushed on. 1 year later, in August of 2002, we baptized 192 people who stepped into the waters of freedom. What we did not know is the next 20 years between then and now, our nation would eventually be entangled in an all-out fight. And here we are, to salvage the values and virtues that have been handed down through generations of Christian history. And then on top of that, you add this partisan political divide. It's going on right now like it's never happened in our lifetime. The influence of Jesus in thousands of local churches across America were being systematically pushed to the margins. We were being told, shh. We don't like your message because you preach intolerance, they said. One Christian leader told me several years ago, Christianity is too exclusive. And I said, you mean Christianity where our leader said, for God so loved the world is exclusive? Add to that a 2020 once-in-a-lifetime pandemic that literally stopped all of us in our tracks. Some of you remember this. We had exactly 36 hours to lock down this campus, to send our staff and volunteers home to be quarantined, and to figure out how in the world are we going to do digital church. It was a crazy time. Fear and frustration were widespread. It was almost like we were facing two epidemics. There was COVID and there was shutdown. 3 weeks later, Easter Sunday, I told Susan, we were locked up, but I told Susan, I said, I got to go over to the church, man. I can't not be at the church building on Easter Sunday. And this place was like a ghost town. And I thought, I'll bet you there's never been another Easter like it. How many of you have ever experienced a moment when your teenager was so frustrated with you? The rules and the boundaries were, it was just more than they could take. And just before stomping out of the room, they said, whatever. You know that one? Leonard Ravenhill was a powerful voice in the 20th century for revival and renewal. And I read almost all of his stuff in preparation for this series, especially the book of his that has really meant the most to me is, he calls it, the title of the book was Revival God's Way, a Message for the Church. And he writes in this book about an era of American history when a frustrated and apathetic Christian church just threw up their hands and said, whatever. Look at what he said. We are troubled by a church that believes in nothing, cares for nothing, seeks to know nothing, interferes with nothing, loves nothing, finds purpose in nothing, lives for nothing, changes nothing, and remains alive only because there is nothing it would die for. He wrote that in the 1980s. America was walking in, well, the world really, but we were all walking into what is now called the post-Christian world, which simply means that Christianity was quickly losing its influence over the values, culture, and worldview of many Americans. Every church, every single church across our land faced a choice. We could either be a church that was searching for and devoted to reaching the unchurched and the spiritually lost. That would be the post-Christian generation. Or we could be a church that would just pacify the church attenders who might even be Christians in name only. You know what the nominal Christians were saying back in the 80s to me? Whatever. Our leaders were saying, no, we're not going to surrender, not on our watch. So we made a no-brainer decision 30 years ago that we would be a place for people who had no authentic relationship with Jesus. It was a decision to simply return to our biblical roots. Do you know the roots I'm talking about? Look at what Jesus said. Here it is. Look at the verbs. Go, make disciples, baptize them, teach them to do what? To go and make disciples. That's it. Now, we sometimes call that the Great Commission, but this was not something that we just talked about here or dreamed about. It was something we looked at that and we said, we are compelled to do this, whatever the cost, the risks, the sacrifices. But to say that it was a dicey, unpredictable few years would be a great understatement. What we did not realize is that the members at SMC who were casual, cultural, name-only Christians, they were not going to be happy at all. They were going to be frustrated and angry, and some were very angry because we were no longer the place that would simply pacify their demands and their preferences. They were mad in a bad way. They were saying, how, you have the audacity to prioritize the needs of people who don't even do church? It was destined to be a bumpy ride for the next 4 or 5 years. But it was worth it when we began to see people come to faith in Christ. Not just a few, but by the hundreds. And then, that's when we realized that the whatever question was irrelevant. The only right question was whoever. Whoever we could introduce to Jesus. And what we did not know is we were about ready to experience an explosive revival that caught us all off guard. So we're scrambling around back in those years, trying to figure out how to put together the infrastructure to make it happen. There was exceptional focus around here and determination. In the words of Bishop Asbury 200 and some years ago, we were just using a bigger fishing net. And every day around here was like revival. Some of y'all remember, don't you? If the baptism videos that we show from time to time, if those don't tenderize your heart, if they don't cause your eyeballs to sweat, as Pastor Phil likes to say, if you just can't get into life change stories, or your heart feels, have you ever picked up a knife in your kitchen and you tried to cut something and then you realized you were trying to cut it with a dull edge? Have you ever felt like you're a dull edge? Sometimes feel like your moments with God are like, am I on a dose of time-released melatonin? Am I asleep? Am I sleepwalking? Then you're a candidate for revival. One of the great voices for revival in America was a man named Charles Finney. You'll hear his name during this series. He was a 19th century preacher who is still called the father of the revival movement. Revival happens when people like us, when we discern the voice of God, when we start following Jesus, walking in his ways. How many times, just in my own privacy, have I said to God, are you sure that's what you want me to do? Hey, look, whatever you do, don't blame anybody around you for your lack of spiritual energy. Well, I wouldn't mind being more involved and engaged, but my husband, my wife, whatever, wants nothing to do with church or the community groups. Why would you allow your spouse to wedge in between you and Jesus? Well, my parents, when I grew up, they were just never into God. You're gonna let your parents get between you and God? I'm so covered up, Bob, with my job right now, and we're trying to recover from COVID. I just can't find the energy to focus on faith issues. Maybe later, you would let your job become between you and God. My kids on a travel team. We're away most weekends. We try to catch the service online, but it's kind of hit and miss because sometimes the games are on Sunday mornings. So you would let a 14-year-old soccer game? Well, we tried a couple of study groups, but y'all never scheduled the groups when it was convenient for us. So you would let convenience come between you and God. We tried to get involved with a community group, but COVID messed that up, and we couldn't meet for a whole year, and so we just never got back together after the restrictions were lifted. I stopped attending, or somebody says, I stopped attending church more than 2 years ago. Somebody hurt my feelings, so I decided who needs it. Do y'all know how many times somebody in this church has hurt my feelings? I would have quit 1,000 times. Can you remember a time when you were praying more, reading more, serving more, volunteering more, giving more? Is it time for revival? Just resolve that your relationship with Jesus is so seriously important and decide that it's way past time to get it right and then get back on track. It might be time for a personal revival. So we were well positioned on March the 15th, 2020. We were in a good place to have to abruptly close down the church because we were already into the digital world. So we just had to fine-tune how we were going to put the service out there. Thousands of you responded to it very well, and we thank you for that. In fact, quite frankly, about half of you liked it so much that I'm talking to that y'all haven't even come back yet. But I'm telling you something now, online church is never gonna be the same as this. Yeah? Let's face it, you know what virtual means? Imitation. It means simulated. I remember the Sunday, one of our senior adults walked in those doors, and it was before the early service. I was just wandering around in here, and I looked back and I saw her, and she came, it was right after she got vaccinated, and she paused when she came in those doors and just broke down in tears. So I rushed back there and I tried to put my arms around her, and she was so embarrassed, and she looked at me and she said, "Bob, it's just a building. I don't know what's going on with me." And I said, "Oh no, it's not just a building. It's the church that gathers in that building. That's what you've missed." We were made for connections and community and relationships, but COVID created a bunch of bad spiritual habits, didn't it? One of the most important reasons why we like to get together like this is because it creates some accountability for us. When we don't have accountability, it's so easy for bad habits to mess us up. You agree? Watching from the couch in your family room or on the deck of your beach house or watching on your cell phone while you're driving to a kid's soccer game, it's just not the same. The scriptures say, we must also consider how to encourage each other. Some people have gotten out of the habit of meeting for worship, but we must not do that. We desperately need each other. Because you see, we never know. You know, you may be on top of the world today, and by tomorrow, that world may roll over on top of you. We don't know. It might be something happens and our health goes south, our marriage gets in a tough spot, our career goes belly up, one of our kids makes a dramatic mistake, a friend or a family member dies. Many of you have experienced life trauma in the past 16 months during COVID. And the restrictions created a very difficult situation for us we couldn't touch each other. We were created. God didn't make us to live on islands of our own making. Isolation doesn't work very well. Now, you might survive, but you will never be everything that God designed you to be if you choose to live in isolation. Let me illustrate that. Let's imagine that you're spending a summer weekend at the lake with some friends, and one of your buddies loses his balance and he falls off the dock, only he doesn't resurface. So 2 or 3 of you dive into the water. It's 10 feet deep. You pull your friend out. You lay him on the dock. You turn him over. You push the water out of his lungs, and you start CPR. Now, if you happen to be successful at rescuing him, what are you going to tell people? Our friend was dying, but thank God we were able to revive him. What about your friends who were drowning spiritually? Are they maybe drowning with indifference and apathy? I'm saying we have responsibility for each other. I could give you multiple examples. I'll just give you 3. Look at what the scriptures say. Everyone should look out, not only for his own interests, but also for the interests of others. Encourage one another, build each other up, carry one another's burdens. In this way, you will fulfill the law of Christ. Is it time for a new awakening? Is it time, SMC, for a revival across our land? But you know what I've noticed looking at American history? And fact check me on this if you want to. You will never be able to find a season of revival in American history ever that was not preceded by a resurgence of thousands of local churches every time. And if ever the church was in need of revival, it could be 2021. Remember that you can't revive somebody who's dead. But whenever we start to talk about revival across America, when a growing percentage of Americans are not followers of Christ, that's trouble. 65% of Americans claim to be Christians, but only half of those are nominal Christians, but they're not sold out to Jesus. So now we're down in the 30s. I also recognize that if we had the capacity to hook our spiritual life up to a heart monitor, most likely it would determine that the heart of our nation is under some significant stress right now. Maybe we're on the verge of a heart attack, I don't know. There are probably some areas of American life that at least need to be connected to life support. And I'll tell you, unless you've been asleep at the wheel, then you know that there's a great need for a spiritual awakening across the American church. Since I was in my late 20s, which is close to 40 years ago now, those decades, 4 decades, and you have a chance to have a fascinating perspective. I turned 20 in 1972. We were only 2 years removed from probably the most volatile decade of the 20th century. Let me take you down memory lane. The decade of the 60s began with such promise. On January 20th, 1960, the youngest man ever, John F. Kennedy was inaugurated as the 35th president. Jobs were plentiful, the economy was strong, confidence was up, hopes were high. Gas was 31 cents a gallon, bread was a whopping 23 cents a loaf. Commentators were calling it the age of Camelot. However, the 60s, which began with unbridled hope and courageous optimism, would experience a lot of chaos. In October of 62, we learned that the Soviet Union was stockpiling nuclear weapons on the island of Cuba. America would come this close to a nuclear holocaust, which would have essentially destroyed the world. The decade of the 60s would end with 2 Kennedy brothers assassinated, a charismatic civil rights leader dead in Memphis, Tennessee, political anger and pandemonium tearing our nation to shreds, racial tension in the streets, a controversial war in the rice paddies of Vietnam, young American men burning their draft cards and shouting, "Hell no, we won't go." And college students burning American flags, protesting everything. Men were walking on the moon for the first time, and thousands of rowdy kids were overdosing on drugs and rock music on a farm outside of Bethel, New York, known as Woodstock. Americans had lost their moral compass. God had been removed from the public schools. Millions across our land were sick and tired of being sick and tired, and rebellion seemed to be the only workable solution. We had had enough. And in the words of Popeye the Sailor Man, when he said, "That's all I can stands and I can't stands no more." August 28th, 1963 was a defining moment in the decade of the 60s. Tens of thousands of people, Americans, gathered in Washington, D.C. on the mall just in front of the Lincoln Memorial to plead for freedom. And in one of the great rhetorical moments of the 20th century, Dr. King spoke for a lot of us when he said, "We cannot turn back. We will not be satisfied until justice rolls down like rivers. And with this faith, we will be able to work together, pray together, struggle together, and stand up for freedom together. It would be fatal for our nation to overlook the urgency of the moment." And we must not make that mistake either, SMC. It's been almost 60 years since that great speech. But there's a new generation, and they're coming behind us, and their future is up for grabs. Many of our founders in this country, as you know, were not deeply devoted followers of Jesus. But it's hard to read the original documents on which America was established without realizing that we were certainly tethered to 3,000 years of Judeo-Christian principles. Many of those early settlers were risking life and future, including the founders of this church, to get on board ships to escape the rising spiritual apathy and hostility that was sweeping across 18th century Western Europe. But unless you've been hibernating for the last 30 or 40 years, then you know that God has been seriously marginalized and shoved to the edges of our American culture in a way that makes the 60s decade look like child's play. Public displays of religious symbols, especially Christian symbols, are systematically being removed. We have been called bigots, narrow-minded, intolerant, judgmental. History is being modified and reinterpreted. Jesus is marginalized. The Bible has been abruptly removed from our culture. The people who don't care for Jesus at all, they say we are dogmatic, that the Bible is narrow-minded, biased, chauvinistic, fanatical, racist, homophobic, xenophobic, and intolerant. The American church is probably going to need to be revived to survive much deeper into the 21st century. If I ask you right now to respond to whether you believe that that it's time, or maybe even past time, for a reawakening to sweep across our land, and especially inside the American church, local churches. Many of you would agree, but the bigger question is whether or not there is enough spiritual devotion and enthusiasm for this generation to pull it off. The question that looms over the 21st century American church is, are we going to be willing to make the necessary sacrifices to pull off the next awakening, not just to save the church, but to redeem a broken culture before we hand it off to our grandkids? I predict that there is coming a must-do moment when the 360,000 local churches across our land can join hands together and say, we've had enough. Don't push us anymore. One of the things that we're going to see as this series develops over the next 4 weeks is that, watch this now, as the church goes, so goes the nation. It's always been that way. And until our hearts are broken for the generations coming after us, and until we decide that we're going to feel a sense of urgency, there cannot ever be revival, resurgence, restoration, and recovery. Here's a passage that will stand at the core of this series, and I can't believe it. Over the years, I've never preached on this passage, but I'm going to. And over the next few weeks, we're going to break it down, literally word for word. God says, if my people who are called by my name will humble themselves and pray and seek my face and turn from their wicked ways, I will hear from heaven and I will forgive their sins and restore their land. It's time for us to pray for a genuine movement of God. It's not about me working up some rah-rah sermons for a series or challenging the musicians here to kick up their worship to a brand new level of energy. It's not talking about something that we can generate, my friends. This is going to require a movement of God. It's not about large crowds and growing attendance. Hey, look, I know how to raise a crowd. I know how to do that. The state fair attracts big crowds. A concert can carry a sold-out crowd in about 6 weeks. Watch this. If you just watch. College football games will stuff their stadiums with big crowds. We're not talking about crowds. Look at what the prophet Amos wrote. God said to Amos, I hate your religious festivals. I despise them. I'm not pleased with your religious assemblies. Even though you bring me sacrificial offering, I won't accept it. Spare me the sound of your songs. I won't listen to the music of your harps. That might mean guitars. But let justice flow like a river and righteousness like an ever-flowing stream. What you're going to learn in the next few weeks is that reawakenings only happen when hearts are broken. That's it. When our independent spirits step back and say, okay, Jesus, we'll let you lead because we haven't done all that well. Every spiritual awakening, fact check me on it, and there have been 4 great awakenings, have always been preceded by the local churches across this land raising the bar and saying apathy and indifference are unacceptable. Look at this in Matthew 24. If you have a Bible and you're reading with me, the heading right here will probably say, Jesus speaks about the future. Watch this. Jesus said, nations will go to war against nation and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in many parts of the world. But all this is only the first of the birth pains with more to come. Then you will be arrested, persecuted, and killed. You will be hated all over the world because you are my followers. And many will turn away from me and betray and hate each other. And many false prophets will appear and will deceive many people. Sin will be rampant everywhere, and the love of many will grow cold. But the one who endures to the end will be saved, and the good news about the kingdom will be preached throughout the whole world so that all nations will hear it, and then the end will come. Now, I'll let you draw your own conclusions to that prophetic word from Jesus. But in the past 300 plus years, desperate times have always led to great awakenings, the awakening of God's people when we just said, that's it, we've had enough. I'm just wondering if our current 2021 is really just setting the table, setting us up for the next great awakening. Signs are that might be about to happen. I'm wondering if the time is coming when God is going to say, I've had it. Alexis de Tocqueville was a 19th century French political philosopher and historian. He wrote this: liberty cannot be established without morality, nor morality without faith. I searched for the greatness and genius of America, but it was not there. I sought for the greatness and genius of America in her fertile fields and boundless forests, but it was not there. I sought for the greatness and genius of America in her vast commerce, and it was not there. I sought for the greatness and genius of America in her public school systems and her colleges and universities, and it was not there. I sought for the greatness and genius of God in her democratic Congress and her matchless Constitution, and it was not there. Not until I went into the churches of America and heard from pulpits, her pulpits flaming with righteousness, did I understand the secret of her genius, greatness, and power. America is great because she is good, and if America ever ceases to be good, America will cease to be great. God said, if my people who are called by my name, our redemptive future is not going to be solved by our politicians and political parties. It's not going to be law enforcement. We've got some courageous men and women across this country dressed in blue, and they are absolutely devoted to making life better across our land, but that's not the answer. It's not up to our courts and judges to make legal decisions and mandate our morality and goodness. It's not about a top-notch system of higher education, and we're just going to educate the badness out of people. It's not realistic to think that spiritual revival is going to start at the White House. Are you kidding me? It's most likely to start in your house and my house and God's house and this house. I'm compelled to look. Hey, look, this is where I'm looking for the brokenness. Something's broken in here too, and it's unacceptable. God says, if my people called by my name. Could it be that the future rests in the hands of the 2 billion followers of Jesus around the world, where we just roll up our sleeves and we stand in the face of the darkness of this world, and we have an adversary who would love to destroy everything good? But when the fully devoted followers of Jesus stand up in every generation and we say that's all we can stand and we can't stand no more. For the first 2 centuries of our nation's history, our strength was grounded in our standards and principles. It was America's generosity and reputation and decency. It was not in our intellect, our wealth, our manpower, not even our extraordinary moral code. It was our convictions, our confidence, and our creeds. It was never in some superstar 18th century founders. It was our allegiance to the plans and priorities of God. It was never about our affluence, our prosperity, or our economic brilliance. When we needed hope, we looked that way, not this way. Our hopes were in God, and we looked to him for direction. We were able to say in the words of David, the king of Israel, David said, some nations boast of their chariots and horses, but we boast in the name of the Lord our God. The moral erosion, if it continues, it will lead to more and more compromise, and if we're not careful, spiritual devotion will start to give way to permissiveness, indulgence, tolerance, and that is unacceptable and reprehensible. But if we're not careful, it will become the acceptable standard. I'm sorry if this is offensive to some of you, but as a Christian leader with decades of life experience, I'm devoted to do my part to stem the tide, to reverse the moral decline of casual Christianity, where thousands of church attenders follow Jesus in name only. I'm done with that. The first time I ever preached here was September the 25th, 1977. I had no idea what a revival was. But 44 years later, I get it. And after all, what is the future of SMC if we don't look different than the rest of the world? I have a biblical, spiritual, moral mandate, and that is to challenge you to a life of prayer, to a life of devotion, to doing life right. And when I see the evil one sifting our local churches and rendering them lifeless and lethargic and disengaged and disconnected, it's unacceptable. Whenever I see it happening, something wells up inside of me and causes me to say, not this time, big boy. Not on my watch, because we have had enough. I love you, SMC.